In the previous video, I went down a rabbit hole explaining how a camera syncs to flash in 3 different ways: using a common shutter at its max sync speed, putting a flash into high-speed sync mode, or using the brand new revolutionary global shutter found in the Sony A9 III. For the second part of this video, we're gonna find out once and for all which method is best. Now, if you haven't seen the first video, I really suggest that you watch that one first, especially if you are at all unfamiliar with concepts like how your shutter works with flash, how sync speed differs from normal flash photography, and why the new Sony A9 III with its global shutter might be the new standard for shooting flash in bright situations outside. Now, the quick 30-second recap. When shooting with high-speed sync mode, you are losing a ton of power because your flash is having to stay on longer, which produces a much lower total output level. But with a global shutter, you're also gonna be losing power because your shutter speed will now become even faster than the flash duration, and you'll start to lose power because you're cutting off a portion of the full burst of light. So this leaves me with really 2 questions that I really wanna answer in this video. 1, does having a global shutter that allows syncing at any shutter speed give you more power and flexibility over a flash in high-speed sync mode? And 2, what are the limitations of using this global shutter with flash? Oh, and for all of those people in the comments complaining that I should just use a neutral density filter and be done with it, well, hold on to your britches because we're gonna be testing this method as well. Now, before I go outside to do these tests, let me just show you a few unique settings that we're going to need to change on the Sony A9 III so that it works best with flash. To set all the flash settings correctly, let's first go down to the exposure setting in the menu and then down to flash. I need to set the flash mode to fill flash. Then go down to wireless flash and turn that off, unless of course you're using a Sony branded flash. Then red eye reduction needs to be turned off. On the menu setting sync terminal, let's set this to always. That's just simply gonna help with misfires. Under regular flash shooting setting, we're gonna make sure that this is 1/60th of a second all the way up to 1/80,000th of a second. And finally, we need to go to the flash timing setting and dial the flash sync to 0 nanoseconds. Now, if you remember the flash duration chart I showed you in the previous video, when our shutter speed starts to get around 1/2000th of a second or higher, a portion of our flash is going to get cut off by the global shutter. If our camera fires the flash too early or too late, the syncing of the shutter might not line up with the absolute peak moment of the flash, and in some cases, we might actually miss the flash entirely. The flash timing setting menu allows us to manually change the sync timing so that we can optimize our exposure with different shutter speeds, different flash power settings, and different flashes from different manufacturers, because of course, every single brand of flash changes the shape of this graph with its own unique flash duration. So now that we know how the flash timing setting affects the flash exposure recorded by the global shutter, I spent several hours in the studio taking test shots, measuring the amount of flash captured at each power setting and shutter speed at different sync offset timings. Now, if you own a Westcott FJ80 SE, you can go ahead and thank me in the comments because I've published the chart right here. But if you own a different flash, unfortunately, you're probably gonna have to do this exact same test unless they were kind enough to publish this chart somewhere online. But now that I got my chart for the FJ80, let's go outside, do some tests, and see how this relates to the real world. Okay, so we've moved outside now, and it's incredibly bright out here. It's about 12 o'clock noon, and it's not only a horrible time of day to take photos, but it's incredibly difficult to use flash in this setting when you're locked in at your camera's maximum sync speed. The sun is not only really bright, but it's also casting straight down, which would typically be an awful environment for taking a portrait with only natural light. So I've set up a simple frame here which kind of replicates a composition that I might choose when taking a picture in a really bright environment like this. The harsh background is properly exposed, but I've also included this dark shaded area, this pillar here, which would be a perfect place that I might set my subject so that I could light them independently with flash. So in setting up this test, I know that I can use the Sony A9 III for the global shutter test, and I can also use a neutral density filter on the front of my lens to do a neutral density test as well. But I'm not so sure how the A9 III is going to work when I put the flash into high-speed sync mode. So instead, I'm gonna be using the Sony A7 IV for the high-speed sync test because it's a traditional rolling shutter, and I know that the flash is designed to work with this camera. Now, I'm going to be changing out the lens and using the same lens on both cameras so that that isn't a variable and the images look as similar as possible. Finally, the base ISO on the A9 III is only 250. And since lower ISOs allow for longer shutter speeds and longer shutter speeds are less taxing on the flash when used in high-speed sync mode, I'm gonna set both cameras to ISO 125. I think that's going to give an advantage to the high-speed sync test, but it seems like the most fair thing to do since ISO 100, 125 is probably more common on more cameras. That being said, I do wish more cameras would allow us to set the ISO even lower, because if we could go to ISO 10 or 25, we wouldn't have to carry around neutral density filters ever and could do extremely long exposures of, say, landscape shots. And also we could use longer shutter speeds when using high-speed sync, because now we're kind of compensating for the exposure using ISO, but I digress. So before I turn on the flash, let's go ahead and take our control images just so that we have them for future reference. So this image was taken at ISO 125, f2.8, and has a shutter speed set to our max sync speed of 1/250th of a second. You can see the frame is blown out, and this is the main problem that we're trying to solve with this test. The next image is shot with the exact same settings, but with a shutter speed of 1/8000th of a second. Our exposure is now correct for the background, so this is the exposure that I'm really gonna be focusing on in this test. Now I'm here in Puerto Rico, and I can't think of a brighter situation than high noon with these camera settings to expose a scene that's completely lit with the sun. So I think this would be a good test, because I personally don't see where I would need to overpower the sun by more than 1/8000th of a second, unless I was shooting with an aperture that's even wider than 2.8, like 1.8 or 1.4. But for the moment, the Sony A9 III can't even use the global shutter with flash and sync above 1/500th of a second, I believe. So I feel like 1/8000th of a second is gonna be the best shutter speed that we could use for this test, and we're gonna roll with that. Now the final control image that I need to take is I need to set my exposure so that I can use my neutral density filter. So I'm going to change my shutter speed down from 1/8000th of a second all the way down to 1/250th of a second, which is the typical sync speed for many cameras, and that's going to allow us to use our flash without using high-speed sync mode. Interestingly enough, that is a full 5 stops difference from 1/8000th of a second down to 2/50th of a second, and the neutral density filter that I have is a variable filter that goes to 5 stops. So if I put this on, I should now have an exposure that is exactly the same. And let me go ahead and turn this so we get the full 5 stops of neutral density, and let's take this control image. Now, as you can see from this image, I'm starting to get a little color cast, and perhaps the image isn't quite as sharp. It might have a little bit of haze compared to the image taken without a neutral density filter. So I'm already a little skeptical that the neutral density filter, which so many people online said was going to be the best way to do this, I'm a little skeptical that it's actually going to look better than high-speed sync or the global shutter, but that's what this test is all about. So first, let's do the global shutter test. Let's go ahead and turn on our flash. My camera settings are ISO 125, 1/8000th of a second, and we're wide open at f2.8. So using my little chart that I made in the studio, I'm gonna go ahead and set my flash to full power, and then I need to go into the menu and change the flash offset to full power at 1/8000th of a second is 200 nanoseconds. Let's go ahead and change that as well. And let's take this photo. And wow, so we have an incredible exposure. The background looks just like it did before, but now the pillar might actually be lit too much. This might be like one stop over. So the next thing I wanna do is let's go ahead and go down to half power, and then using my chart, I'm gonna have to change my sync setting from 200 nanoseconds down to 500 nanoseconds. Let's take this image. All right, so this image looks great, and we still have a lot of exposure from our flash, but now we're at 1/2 power, which means not only am I gonna get a faster refresh rate, but I'm going to also save a ton of battery power, which is going to allow me to shoot much longer throughout the day without having to change the battery pack. So now I'm just gonna reduce the power on my flash further and run through all of these tests at lower and lower powers just to see if there's a sweet spot where I can maintain the same exposure on the pillar, but decrease the power setting as far as I can so that I'm getting the maximum refresh rate and the maximum use of my battery. Now, each time that I set the flash lower and lower, I'm also going to have to change the sync timing in the menu. So there's the 5 images that I've taken all the way from full power down to 1/16th power. Now, before I switch over to the A7 IV, let's go ahead and do our neutral density test. I'm gonna go ahead and add that to the lens here. And let's slow our shutter down from 1/8000th of a second down to 2/50th of a second. Here's our first image using full power. And I can't quite tell yet if this is more or less than the global shutter images, but very few people like to shoot out on location at full power. So let's go ahead and do the same thing where we take an image here at half power, and we'll set it down to a quarter power and take an image. And I can already tell at a quarter power, this is not very effective, so I don't think we need to go any further with this test. So now that we've taken all of our exposures for the global shutter using the adjustable sync speed to make sure that that exposure is as effective and powerful as it possibly can be, and we've taken our exposures, changing the exposure to 2/50th of a second and adding the neutral density on the front, now I think we can finally change over to the Sony a7 IV and try out the high-speed sync test. Man, it is hot out here. I am really starting to sweat. It's just one more reason I don't like shooting at this time of the day, but sometimes, you know, just shooting a wedding or something, you have to shoot at this time of day. So let's keep moving on with this test. We now have the a7 IV on top of our camera. Let's take our neutral density filter off and let's set our shutter back to 1/8000th of a second so that we have the same exposure. Let's go ahead and take another control image at the same settings as before, but on this camera just so that we have it. So again, this is 1/8000th of a second, ISO 125, and wide open at 2.8. Now, even though both of these cameras are set to the same white balance, 5000 Kelvin, and they're using the same lens, there is a slight difference in color on these images for some reason, maybe a slight difference in contrast as well, but the overall exposure still looks about even. So that is kind of interesting, but I don't think it's gonna play a huge role in the flash power test that we're trying to ultimately do here. So now I'm gonna put the flash into high-speed sync mode. Let's change it up to full power and take an image. All right, so clearly this is the worst performing method by far. I'm gonna go ahead and go down one stop to half power just to see what it does, and 1/4 power, but clearly this isn't gonna be adequate. So I think it's pretty clear that high-speed sync mode is not the most effective way to overpower the sun in a situation like this. So it's pretty clear to see, even on the back of my camera, that the high-speed sync is the worst performing of all of these. But there's one more test that I wanna do. I wanna see how does the flash perform at an incredibly fast shutter speed. And I just realized that 1/8000th of a second is the fastest shutter speed that the a7 IV will even go to. So let's go ahead and get the A9 III back on here and see what the exposure is gonna look like at an incredibly fast shutter, like 1/80,000th of a second. All right, so I've set my shutter speed to 1/80,000th of a second, and I've set my FJ80 SE to full power. In the menu, I've changed my sync offset to 380 nanoseconds, which is the optimal sync that I found in our studio tests. And now let's take an image. Oh my gosh, that is crazy. I've never seen an image like this. I've literally almost made my entire scene black. It almost looks like a nighttime shot, even with the strobe going off. Now I can notice the colors on my test sheet and the background being lit by the sun are a little wonky. They're almost like a little bit blue. Obviously the color difference in the sun's not changing, but I don't know if like shooting at this fast of a shutter just naturally captures less of the wavelength or the color spectrum. I don't really know what's happening. So maybe we can warm this up in Lightroom and see if that will produce an image that looks more accurate. But this is absolutely incredible. So now that we've taken all of these images, I want to look at these on a computer nice and large before I make my final conclusion. So let's head back inside. All right, so what are my overall thoughts and conclusion on this test? Well, first off, the global shutter clearly is the best option for syncing flash in the brightest part of the day with a shutter speed of 1/8000th of a second. The neutral density filter method came in number 2 with about 1 to 2 stop lower exposure, but I was only really able to achieve that by setting the flash to full power. With the global shutter, I was able to still maintain more flash exposure while setting my Westcott flash 2 or 3 stops lower, which means I get more battery life and a much faster recycle speed. Using both the global shutter and the neutral density filter, I did wind up with some pretty substantial changes in color or white balance. I feel like I can negate that pretty easily in Photoshop or Lightroom, but I really didn't expect there to be as big of a difference as there was. As for setting the flash into high-speed sync mode, I don't think there was really any comparison. The full power shot wasn't even able to come close to some of the exposures using the other 2 methods, and by a quarter power, this flash wasn't even registering at all. So in my mind, there is no doubt that the global shutter is the best way to sync flash with your camera. At best, it's able to produce an image that you simply can't produce using any other method. At worst, it might give you the same kind of exposure that you would get using a neutral density filter, but because we're setting the power so much lower, it's just way more efficient at it, which is gonna be better for battery life and better at shooting rapidly when you need the refresh rate to be much quicker. The final thing I wanna say about this test is even though the global shutter is the clear winner, And it offers other advantages like shooting at 1/80,000th of a second, which no other method can do at all. The biggest issue that I have with this is that you need to make all of these sync timetables for each of your flashes at every power level and at every shutter speed to get the maximum benefit. There is no way that I will ever do this test on all of my flashes, so I'm probably just gonna record a few settings at the most useful camera settings and just resort to those when I'm out on the field shooting in really bright situations. For me, that's probably gonna be setting the flash to 1/4 power and shooting at 1/4000th of a second, 1/8000th of a second. And then for those really crazy situations where I wanna overpower the sun and make it look dark outside, I also wanna know those settings at 1/80,000th of a second. Hopefully in the future, Sony will somehow allow these data tables to be communicated between the two flashes. I don't know if that means that Sony will somehow have a way to do that automatically, or if you'll have to go into a menu and set the brand and model flash that you're using so that it can use some kind of built-in data table to like go ahead and put those offset syncs in, but that would be incredibly useful if they could find a way to do that. Of course, they probably won't do that because Sony sells their own flash and they're probably gonna want you to buy that so that it can communicate as perfectly as possible. So that's a huge downside in my opinion. So until then, photographers are gonna be stuck having to fumble around with this sync setting out on location and have, you know, a chart on their phone or in their pocket or taped to the side of the flash. I just don't see how there's any way around that. The other issue that I'm not entirely sure of yet is what happens when you add multiple flashes in your scene and you have to deal with this offset sync timing. If all of the flashes were, say, the FJ80 and you have 2 or 3 of these in your scene and they're all set to 1/4 power, maybe you would have no problem at all. But what happens when you start setting one flash to full power and another one to 1/16th power, and then you're using one final flash that you have in your bag just to make the shot work and you're putting that off to the side? I don't think you're gonna find one perfect sync offset time that works for all 3 of them at all different power settings. So I could see that being a real pain in the butt. And of course, not everybody has 1, 2, or 3 flashes that are all exactly the same. Maybe for me, the answer is just to prioritize your key light. That's the most important light. And then all of the other lights in your scene might struggle a little bit because the offset isn't perfect, but I can see that being a huge problem and something that I definitely would not want to tackle out in the field. So there you go. I hope you guys enjoyed this video as much as I did. I know I learned a lot from this test. If you have other tests that you'd like me to do or have different experiences from your own work using the Sony A9 III, leave those in the comments below. I would like to thank Westcott for sending me over the FJ80 SE flash to run this experiment on. If you want to check this thing out or get one for yourself, I think these are like 200 bucks. Go to the link in the description below or head over to Westcott's website. I also want to just quickly mention that every month Fstoppers is running a contest for our Critique the Community series. This month we are doing unique lighting. There's still a few days left to enter. You can enter up to 3, maybe even 4 images, and every month we're giving away some incredible prizes. So if you're a photographer who has some images with really unique lighting, head over to fstoppers.com/contest to enter. If you're seeing this after that contest is wrapped up, check it out anyways because we have a new contest every single month. And if you're a photographer who feels like maybe this is a little bit over your head or you want to learn how to do flash photography even better, head over to fstoppers.com/store where you can check out our full length tutorials. We have some really in-depth tutorials on everything from landscape photography, architectural photography, macro photography, portrait and wedding photography. There's literally something for everybody. So definitely check that out as well. Right now we're running a deal on Peter Hurley's Illuminating the Face. You can get that for $50 for this month only. If you want to pick up that tutorial or any of our tutorials for 15% off, go to the link in the description below. Thank you for watching and I will see you guys really soon.